Question 1. How do we compare the homogeneity of an entire landscape treated with the same hazard reduction burn treatment plan to a landscape burnt by bushfire? Several factors affect the intensity of a fire and the resulting severity of the fire, that is to say, the amount of biomass that's consumed within the fire. So factors that affect fire intensity can include slope, exposure to sun and wind, and local fuel moisture. So hazard reduction treatment plans are targeted to times of year, generally autumn and spring, when there's less heat and more moisture in the landscape. And because there are stronger differences, stronger variations, they have a greater effect on local fire behavior, creating a more patchy result. Bushfires, on the other hand, tend to happen in hotter and drier times of year, so the variation is less pronounced. The variation of temperature and moisture, for example, is less pronounced. So bushfires in many cases are able to just kind of ignore these local variations and roll across the landscape, producing a more homogeneous result. Question 2. Is old-growth vegetation of significantly higher importance to native fauna compared to young vegetation? If so, how can hazard reduction burning plan for this? Different species prefer different vegetation ages. Studies conducted both in Australia and elsewhere have found that native birds and mammals prefer different vegetation ages. So some species will thrive very early on after a fire. Some species prefer kind of a mid-range of vegetation age, and some species prefer old-growth vegetation. Now, old growth is harder to obtain than younger vegetation ages, so it is important that we plan and burn strategically in order to retain old growth within a landscape that also contains vegetation of young and mid-range ages. So things that can be done to promote the retention of old growth might include keeping the surrounding fuels at a fairly young age so that there's less likelihood that a bushfire will run into the old growth from surrounding vegetation. Another method that might seem counterintuitive at first is to conduct very low intensity prescribed burns within the old growth in order to reduce the fuel loads and the fuel structure at the surface level, but retain some of the structural complexities and features of old growth in the overstory and the canopy. Question 3. Should water management be considered a central element of planning when thinking of fire prevention and management? In Australia, really as in everywhere, water is life, but it seems especially pertinent on a continent that has so many locations that are semi-arid. So yes, it's very important to plan for water management when prescribed burns or hazard reduction burns are being planned. So water management is actually somewhat of a complex issue. There are many things that affect it. So this can include the more obvious things like runoff of soil or nutrients or ash into water supplies, but it can also include soil erosion because of the exposure of the soil, and also uptake of water by a flush of plants regrowing following the fire. So in order to help mitigate the loss of water or the contamination of water, low intensity hazard reduction burns are really important because they help retain some of the structure in the form of, say, sticks and roots and things in the soil that helps hold the soil in place and makes it less susceptible to erosion, and as a result it's less susceptible to actually be running off into water catchments. Low intensity burns also are less likely to promote a large flush of vegetation, which can actually be quite thirsty in the early years following a fire, especially an intense bushfire. Question 4. How can hazard reduction burns adjust for the diminishing moisture differential associated with climate change? There's really no easy answer to this question because fire in the landscape is complex and affected by so many things, including time. The best practice is to both be adaptive and to look to both new and old ways of burning so that we can best use the moisture that is still in the landscape. So these ways might include doing more burns at night, or perhaps shifting some of the burns into the winter months. Personally, I think it's also wise to look to traditional ways of burning to see what methods were used by the indigenous Australians that we could still use effectively today, noting that the landscape has been changed not only by climate but also by Western occupation. Question 5. Do I know of any research into natural fire reduction, such as fungi, invertebrates, small mammalian diggers and scratchers, and lyrebirds, which are prodigious scratchers, and compost tumblers? So there are a handful of studies in Australia and elsewhere that suggest that bioperturbation, which is the fancy term for digging and scratching and soil turnover, that bioperturbation can decrease fire behavior. But a lot of these studies show an indirect relationship. So what is clear is that digging and scratching will increase the amount of fine litter and decrease the amount of coarse litter. But where it becomes unclear is that fire behavior is affected by fuel structure to a greater degree than fuel load. In addition, diggings are associated with more bare patches and there's more moisture in the pits. But the soil that's excavated in the little mound beside the pit is actually drier than the surrounding undug or unaffected soil. So again, there is a shift, there's an increase in variation associated with digging and scratching, and it's quite likely that this would be seen by a low intensity prescribed burn as it moves across the landscape. So it could help promote local variation, patchiness, mosaic, whichever term you prefer. It would promote this given a low intensity fire moving across the landscape. When a fire is high intensity, which is typical for a lot of bushfires, it's less likely to be affected by these small scale variations, and so it's more likely to just kind of roll across the landscape. Another thing to consider, it's quite unfortunate that foxes and feral cats predate the native diggers and scratchers in Australia, enough so that their populations are quite low and even locally extinct in some areas. And it's unlikely that introducing or reintroducing these native diggers and scratchers into areas where there's still foxes and cats would be successful. Another thing to consider with digging and scratching is that the microclimates created by diggers actually seem to be good places for soil fungi to grow, but also help promote the germination of some seeds. So there might actually be a counter effect of promoting greater vegetation growth with these diggings, unless the dig is re-excavated at a later time. That said, it appears that around 50% or more of diggings are re-excavated, which just adds to the overall complexity.